morning session on the Metaphysics of Consciousness. My name is Paavo Pylkkänen. I will be chairing this session. And so our first speaker is Professor Martin Nida Rümelin with the title, Does Self-Awareness Provide Access to Our Own Metaphysical Nature? Please.
This is very, okay. Good morning. The light is very bright. Is that necessary? Yeah. Okay. So, as you see, I will talk about the question whether self-awareness provides access to our own metaphysical nature. And my answer will be, yes, it does provide access to our own metaphysical nature. And more precisely, the thesis I would like to propose and I will argue for in this lecture is the following. Based on pre-reflective self-awareness, we all have a nature-revealing understanding of what it is for individuals that are conscious to be identical. In particular, of what it is for them to be identical across time. So to give a little content, to give content to this thesis, I will have to explain what I have in mind when I talk of pre-reflective self-awareness. It's a very simple form of self-awareness, which does not require any reflection, which does not require any conceptualization or any thought about oneself. And my claim then will be that we understand what it is for conscious individuals to be identical with one another based on that self-awareness. Now, when I talk of nature revealing, I mean what I just said, to understand what it consists in, what it really is for conscious individuals to be identical to one another. So I will give a positive answer to my title question, but the positive answer really talks about a specific aspect of our metaphysical nature, namely what our identity consists in. Perhaps before I start, I should make it easier for you to follow by describing the big steps that I would like to take in my presentation. So the first step will be that I will try to make it clear what phenomenon I'm talking about when I'm talking of pre-reflective self-awareness. The second step will be to talk about belongingness of experiences to a subject. So perhaps a little bit of my background assumptions. I do not believe that experiences can pop up without there being someone who has the experience. And then the question arises, what is it for an experience to belong to me as opposed for a token experience to belong to somebody else? And so the second big step in what I'm trying to bring across is to say the following. Based on our pre-reflective self-awareness, we understand what it is for a token experience to belong to a given subject, for a token experience to belong to me, for instance. Then the third step is to say we have a concrete understanding, a substantial understanding of what it is to be identical across time, which uses this understanding of experiences belonging to a specific subject. And so what I would like to argue is, since we have an understanding of what it is for an experience to belong to a specific subject, we then also have an understanding, a nature-revealing understanding of what it is for experiencing subjects to be identical. And the last step is to say, now, what is that understanding? What does it reveal about identity for conscious individuals? And my claim will be that it reveals that identity of conscious individuals is very specific. It's simple. It doesn't allow for any ontological reduction. Okay? So these are the steps of what I'm trying to do. Before I can explain how I understand pre-reflective self-awareness, just a few preliminaries. So experiences, in my understanding, are a specific kind of events. And there are events in which experiencing subjects have specific properties. So in my understanding, an experience is an event in which an experiencing subject has an experiential property. Experiential properties I would like to define in the following manner. A property is an experiential property if and only if, for any instantiation of that property by some individual, it is something like for that individual to instantiate. It is like something for that individual to instantiate that property. So I'm using this famous Nagel locution of something, it's something like for someone, but I'm using this locution to distinguish experiential properties from other properties. So typical experiential properties, I'm now presented with a visual scenery of people here in front of me. And it's something like, for me, I always don't say like something or something like. What do I have to say? Like something. So, thank you. It's like something for me to be presented with this visual scenery. Or if someone feels a pain, then it's something like for that individual. It's like something for that individual to feel that pain. And so typical experiential properties are properties associated with bodily feelings, with perceptions. But I agree with those people who say that experiential properties also involve properties like being thinking about something. Being thinking about a philosophical problem is also, in my view, an experiential property. It's like something for you to think about something. Okay. Now, what is it to have an experience then for an individual? Very simply, to have an experience is to instantiate such a specific property, to instantiate an experiential property. And now, how do I understand pre-reflective self-awareness? Here is my thesis. Whenever a mature human subject has an experiential property, this is to say, undergoes an experience. That's exactly the same thing. So whenever a mature human subject has an experiential property, then that subject is in a pre-reflective manner aware of being the one who has that property. And that means, given my understanding of experiential properties, that means nothing but the following. That subject is aware of it being like something for it to have that experience, to have that experiential property. So I take, again, the example of seeing this visual scenery in front of me. According to this claim, I'm not only aware of the visual scenery in front of me when I look at you, but I'm also aware of it being like something for me to see that visual scenery, to be presented with that visual scenery. I'm also aware of myself in this very weak sense of being aware of it being something like something for me to have this visual experience. Now, I should point out that this awareness is really very simple It does not require that I think about myself as having that experience, or that I think about myself at all. It is not conceptual. And perhaps even more importantly, it is what some people say, it's not objectual, it's non-objectual. So it's not that when I look at this visual scenery, there is one thing that is presented to me, namely this scenery and you and everything there. But in addition, I myself am given to me as another object among the things I'm aware of. That would be the wrong way to think of it. I would like to put it in this way. When I'm aware of myself as the one for whom it's like something to see, I do not myself occur in my stream of consciousness as a further object given to me, right? That's not like it, right? And yet, it's correct to say that I'm aware of myself as the subject of the experience that I'm undergoing. Okay. Now, as I said, pre-reflective self-awareness is not conceptual. It doesn't yet include any formation of any concept. But what I would like to say now is the following. Based on that pre-reflective and still non-conceptual self-awareness, any mature human being can form a clear understanding of what it is for a given token experience to be his or her. So what we are talking about now is this. Here we have experiences, and then we have subjects, and experiences belong to subjects. And I'm saying, based on that self-awareness that I have been talking about, each of us has an understanding, a clear understanding of what it is for a token experience to be his or her. I think I must explain this to get the intuitive idea across, and it's good to think of it in the first person. So for instance, to understand what it is for a given token experience to be mine. Now this is now the reasoning that leads us to this conclusion. So first point that we have to see is, to understand what it is for a given token experience to be mine, I only must understand what it takes for an experiential property to be instantiated by me. Here I simply apply my definition of what experiences are. That an experience is mine just means that the experience is the instantiation of an experiential property which I instantiate, and I am the one who instantiates it. So to say that the experience is mine is just to say that the corresponding experiential property is instantiated by me. And now we can apply the specific understanding of what experiential properties are that I proposed earlier, and we can say the following. In order to understand what it is for an experiential property to be instantiated by me, I only must understand what it takes, that it is like something for me to have that property, okay? So to understand what it is for a token experience to be mine, I only have to get a grip, to grasp what it is for me that to have a certain property is something like for me. And here the idea comes in that when you are aware in this very simple, primitive way of pre-reflective self-awareness, you have the most direct access one could possibly have to what it is for someone that something that having a property is like something for him, right? Okay, this is the idea. Okay, so I come to the following claim. Based on pre-reflective self-awareness, I have a nature-revealing understanding of what it takes, that it is something like for me to instantiate a given experiential property. And the same is true for each of you. And then again, we just must have in mind that for a token experience to belong to me, just is that the experiential property, having that experiential property is something like for me. And so I can conclude, based on pre-reflective self-awareness, each of us has a nature-revealing understanding of what it takes that a given experience belongs to him or to her. And now I would like to make a big step, and perhaps we can talk about this in the discussion. I would like to say the following. This understanding that we can form based on our self-awareness not only provides me with an understanding of what it is for a token experience to be mine, but it also provides me with an understanding of what it is for a token experience to be yours, for a token experience to belong to Julien, or for a token experience to belong to Dave. So when I can pick out an experiencing subject, an individual that I take to be conscious, then I understand what it is for a token experience to belong to that subject in the very same manner. I simply understand it's something like for that individual to have that experience. Okay. Okay. So where did we get so far? I came up with the conclusion that given our pre-reflective self-awareness, we all understand what it is for a token experience to belong to a specific subject. And this is my first premise that I will need in my argument. Our natural understanding of what it is for an experience to belong to a given subject is nature revealing. And intuitively, the justification I gave for this is that it is based in pre-reflective self-awareness, and that pre-reflective self-awareness provides the most direct way one can have access to what it is for an experience to belong to someone. And again, when I talk of nature revealing, that a conceptualization or a concept or an understanding is nature revealing, I always mean that that understanding or concept provides one with a full understanding of what, if it's a fact, of what the fact really consists in. Now, the next step I have to take is to say something about the role this specific understanding of belongingness of an experience to a subject plays in our understanding of identity across time, or also transtemporal identity, or also transworld identity. But in this talk, since it's a short talk, I focus on transtemporal identity. Just think for that purpose of one of those very famous thought experiments, and the thought experiments that I will be using is the one of a brain division. So the case is the following. You have a person, Andrea. Andrea undergoes a surgery, and her brain is divided into two. And the left hemisphere is transplanted into one living body, and the right hemisphere is transplanted into another human body. As you will know, this is an example that has provoked a lot of discussion. It raises the issue about who is who in that example. Is Andrea the person with the left hemisphere after the surgery? Is original Andrea the person with the right hemisphere? Or is perhaps Andrea, doesn't she exist anymore? Or is it the case that perhaps she is both in some sense, right? So I will not take any stance on what would be the correct answer in such a case. That's not at all what I'm aiming at. What I'm aiming at is to use this example to bring to the surface for you how we naturally think about such a case, how we understand what it would be for Andrea to be, for instance, the one with the left hemisphere. And to understand this, it's helpful to consider first the case from the first-person perspective. If you are Andrea and you know, 5 minutes, okay. If you are Andrea and you know that your brain will be transplanted, then when you ask, will I be the one with the left hemisphere, what you really want to know and how you understand your question is, will I have the experiences of that person? Will I wake up in the room in which El Andrea wakes up? Will I have the life that El Andrea will be leading? So what we can say, this is a logical truth, but we use it in order to understand what identity consists in. Andrea is identical with El Andrea if and only if the following holds. Any experience which belongs to El Andrea also belongs to Andrea and vice versa. Yeah? And now you see, if you understand identity in this way, then you really understand identity using your understanding of what it is for an experience to belong to a specific subject. So this is the second premise. If A and B are conscious subjects, then one can conceptualize what it is for A and B to be identical by thinking of A and B as sharing all experiences. And when you think of them as sharing all experiences, you are, of course, using your concept of what it is for an experience to belong to a specific subject. And here is the first part of the argument. So we have the first premise. Our natural understanding of what it is for an experience to belong to a given subject is nature revealing. Second, if A and B are conscious subjects, then we naturally conceptualize what it is for A and B to be identical by thinking in that natural manner of A and B as sharing all experiences. Furthermore, that's pretty clear, if our natural understanding of what it is for an experience to belong to a given subject is nature revealing, then our natural understanding of what it is for A and B to share all token experiences is nature revealing as well. And then we can use premise 1 and 3, and we get our understanding of what it is for A and B to share all experiences is nature revealing. And then we use premise 2 and this result, and we come to the conclusion. Our natural understanding of what it is for conscious subjects to be identical is nature revealing as well. Now, so far, I haven't said anything about what it reveals, what that nature-revealing concept of identity of conscious subjects really reveals. What does it tell us about what identity of conscious individuals is? And here's the last part. I would like to say that this self-awareness-based understanding that I claim we all share, even if we are not all aware of this self-awareness-based understanding of identity of conscious beings across time reveals that identity really is simple in the case of conscious subjects. That those who say that it cannot be reduced to psychological relations or to body relations or to whatever are right. The so-called simple view is correct. And how do I get to this conclusion? I have the abbreviation SAUI for self-awareness-based understanding of identity of conscious beings. First premise, that specific understanding is nature revealing. That's what I have been arguing for. Second, if identity of conscious beings consists in identity-neutral relations, and here I mean relations such as remembering, the later person remembers what the first did, she executes those acts that the earlier person planned, and so on and so forth, or that there is a certain bodily relation between the later and the earlier conscious subject. So if it were so that we could ontologically reduce identity to such relations, then any nature-revealing conceptualization of our identity of conscious subjects, should, of course, reveal that this is so. However, our understanding, which is based on self-awareness of identity of conscious beings, does not reveal anything like that. And so, the identity of conscious beings really is simple. Do I have 20 seconds? A minute? Oh, great. Perfect. Because what I wanted to say, this is my last slide. I now wanted to say just very briefly a few words about what does this imply for the metaphysics of consciousness. First thing is it implies that experiencing subjects belong to their own very special category, ontological category. Normal things like plants or tables or ships and so on do not have simple identity conditions, as one might say. The simple theory of identity does not apply to them. But, if I'm right, it applies to experiencing subjects. Perhaps it also applies to fundamental particles. But I can't see that it applies to anything else. So if this is right, then we can say in what sense the occurrence of consciousness when a certain information processing system at a certain point of its development gives rise to there being consciousness brings about something totally novel. So one way to say what's novel about it is to say, well, it brings about experiences. If it brings about experiences, it brings about the existence of there being someone, an experiencing subject. And if so, it brings about the existence of an individual which belongs to a totally new and strange, in a certain sense, specific ontological category. One might think that one is forced into what I call subject-body dualism, if one accepts this result. This would mean that one says experiencing subjects cannot be identified with any material object, neither with their brain nor with the organism they have. It's not the only view that is still compatible with my results. One could also endorse a different view and say experiencing subjects are organisms. They are organisms of a very specific kind. They are organisms to which apply simple identity criteria, simple identity, once they are conscious. But this is not so before they become conscious. So there are two fundamentally different kinds of organisms, if this is the view one would like to accept. Those that are not conscious with the normal reducible identity conditions, and then those that are conscious and to which applies the simple theory of identity. That's all.
So our next speaker is Professor William Seeger from the Philosophy Department at the University of Toronto, and he will be telling us about presence and panpsychism. Please.
Thank you. Is that? Well, thanks to the organizers, Harold and Stuart. I guess we're entering well into the third decade of these conferences now. They remain very interesting. I want to talk about what may or may not be a kind of panpsychism. You can decide for yourself when we get to the end. So first of all, a mandatory preamble. What do I take to be consciousness? There are many, many definitions that are possible. I don't want to diss any of these definitions. I think they're all reasonably good notions of consciousness, but they all depend on what I would call a minimal conception of consciousness. So I don't think consciousness is transcendental subjectivity or self-awareness or a reflective appreciation of what is present or availability to thought. Something simpler. I just mean what is present to the mind. And the range of things that are present is huge and various. The limits are unknown to us. Examples: bare sentience, complex appreciative gaze at a Vermeer. Apparently, Bertrand Russell once was cycling around Cambridge and had an epiphany which he expressed as, "My God, the ontological argument is sound." He changed his mind later. But that's another element of what is available, what is conscious, what is present to the mind. And the what it is like locution is pointing to these elements. Given this, why is there a problem of consciousness? A diagram that illustrates it, I like anyway. There's a problem of a mismatch between what we take to be the nature of matter and the nature of consciousness. We understand matter quite well. We understand consciousness by direct experience. They must link together, but of course, if you try, it just does not work, right? You just cannot link them together. So something like that. The famous statement of this worry in the 19th century by Thomas Huxley, how it is that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as a result of irritating nervous tissue is just as unaccountable as the appearance of the jinn when Aladdin rubbed the lamp. If we think of the world from a physicalist perspective, why do we need sentience in the form of consciousness? All we need, would seem, is a complex articulation of reactivity. Now, if you have panpsychist leanings, then you say, oh, this is a clue. Right? This isn't a problem, this is a clue. Reactivity maybe just is sentience or minimal consciousness. Let me just mention, I do not intend to discuss the classic core lines of argument that lead to the sense that the problem of consciousness is different and bigger than most philosophical problems. We have Nagel's famous "What It Is Like to Be a Bad" argument, Jackson's famous Mary thought experiment, and the long line of descent from Descartes to David Chalmers, the conceivability arguments that seem to dislink consciousness from the material world, which I would describe as the arbitrariness, so the apparent arbitrariness of conscious states relative to their physical basis. All of these arguments seem to kind of be honing in on this. Right? If you think about modal arguments, just consider the difference between visual and auditory experiences, which are utterly different phenomenologically, but in a certain sense, in a basic sense, have similar structural features. Three basic qualities: brightness, hue, saturation for vision, and loudness, pitch, and timbre for audition. But the qualities are completely distinct. Why are they so distinct? It seems to be metaphysically arbitrary, the link between the physical and the resulting conscious state. Nothing seems to prevent minor changes across physically identical possible worlds, or even major inversions across physically identical worlds. If you compare this to the physical situation, we find it is completely different. If you imagine asking yourself, well, in a different possible world that's physically identical, fundamentally, to our world, could the boiling point of water be different? Even just a little bit? And the answer, of course, is no, because the boiling point of water is entailed by the fundamental physical state of the world. In fact, you can see the entailment worked out if you look at this paper, for example, where the fluid phase equilibrium of water is generated from quantum mechanics. I'll point out, though, that in their work, they're very proud of themselves for getting to within 40 degrees centigrade of the boiling point of water from first principles. But that is computational difficulty, not a matter of principle. We have no problem understanding how it could be that the boiling point of water is indeed entailed by the fundamental physical underlying state. Whereas for consciousness, we don't see why the underlying physical state should entail any particular state of consciousness at all. Now, I want to just digress very briefly. The problem of consciousness really does strike people as difficult, and I think a sign of this is that some people find it so difficult that they resort to denying the phenomena in question. They will say the consciousness does not exist. Daniel Dennett would be one example. There's a book on illusionism, a nice book which came out recently. We should ask, though, could consciousness be an illusion? And there's an immediate and obvious argument against this. If it seems that there is consciousness, and it certainly does seem like there is consciousness, then there are seemings, and seemings are instances of consciousness, and therefore illusionism collapses. Now, that would be too fast, although actually I do think that's a sound argument. But the word seems is ambiguous between both a phenomenal reading, as when I seem to see red, and a epistemic reading, as when I say it seems that Trump has done something awful again today. Right? Maybe it just epistemically seems that there are phenomenal seemings. Right? And that would rescue the argument. But I don't think that really works, and I'll spend a slide on it. One, it depends upon being able to have a notion of epistemic seemings that is entirely divorced from consciousness. And I don't think you could make that work, actually. Here's another problem which I also worry about for illusionism. If consciousness is illusory, what grounds the Cartesian certainty that something is happening right now? Right? No matter, we all have an immediate awareness that something is going on. We may not know what it is. Maybe I'm dreaming, hallucinating, but something is happening. Could it be that that is an illusion? Right? It just epistemically seems that something exists, but really nothing exists. I don't think that makes any sense, right? It's incoherent. It could not be that it just epistemically seemed that there are epistemic seemings, right? Or that it's merely highly probable that something is happening now, or that something exists. No, I think something is present to the mind independent of the epistemic status. That's minimal consciousness. The other side of the problem is, of course, matter. Traditionally, matter is taken to be solid, impenetrable, massy stuff, capable of motion and taking up volume. It's intrinsically passive, entirely non-conscious. This description of matter was regimented in the 17th century. Leibniz, who was a believer in the mechanical philosophy within the material world, writes that this picture of matter explains everything in the nature of body through number, measure, weight, size, and motion, and teaches that nothing is moved except through contact and motion, and so teaches that in physics, everything happens mechanically, that is, intelligibly. I think this view still governs our intuitions about the material world, but in that view, there is no need for consciousness. Consciousness is a mere appendage in that picture of the world. Right? An option, an upgrade, right? You could have the world without consciousness. You could throw consciousness in. That would be like the upgrade, right? But the material world wouldn't care in the least about that. Now, in fact, this was realized instantly as soon as the mechanical view was enunciated, or even before, because Galileo first writes that, yes, the material world must be understood mathematically, and then he immediately adds, tastes, odors, colors, and so on are no more than mere names, so far as the object in which we place them is concerned. They reside only in consciousness. Hence, if the living creature were removed, all these qualities would be wiped away and annihilated. Right? So there you have your picture. The material world sits and operates independently. Consciousness is this optional extra that is hived away somewhere else. Galileo, of course, could be excused. Consciousness is hard to explain, and it's less difficult to explain the motion of balls rolling down inclined planes. Right? Now, I call this picture of the world the Lego world, where you imagine the world just being made of material bits and pieces that are stuck together according to interesting rules. It's extremely interesting lesson of modern science that this picture is completely wrong. It's as if we sent explorers out. We said, yeah, we know we have got Lego world. You guys go and explore it and tell us how it works in detail. And our explorers went out and they worked for 400 years and they came back and they say, well, you know, actually, Lego world is completely wrong. All right? Here's some quotes. This from Hans Primus. The historical idea that the material world is structured by interacting atoms is in sharp contradiction to basic insights suggested by quantum mechanics. A nice quote from David Wallace, philosopher of physics. The popular impression of particle physics as about the behavior of lots of little particles whizzing about bears as much relation to real particle physics as the earth, air, fire, water theory of matter bears to the periodic table. On the other hand, what quantum mechanics is trying to tell us about the nature of the world remains highly controversial. Right? Wikipedia lists about 24 interpretations of quantum mechanics at the present time. Oh, so here's a sample. David Bohm writes, what they take to be the lesson of quantum mechanics. The entire universe must, on a very accurate level, be regarded as a single indivisible unit in which separate parts appear as idealization. Wigner said, the laws of quantum mechanics cannot be formulated without recourse to the concept of consciousness. Bohr, the most radical, in a way, there is no quantum world. There is only an abstract quantum physical description. It's wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out how nature is. Physics concerns what we can say about nature. For now, the bottom line is the question of the fundamental nature of matter is wide open. Now, the last section, which is about what I would call presence, which I alluded to, but I alluded to it in a way I think is wrong. I said presence to mind, but it's more complicated, or less, I'm not sure actually. Several strands come together here. We have a problem understanding how matter can evolve, realize, or generate consciousness. But we realize we have no positive conception of what the material world is in itself. Our theories do a great job describing the relational structure of the world with ever increasingly distant links to observable outcomes of experiments. If you think about the deepest researches in the nature of matter, say at the Large Hadron Collider, the move from experimental setup to predicted outcome is unbelievably complicated. We have fundamental physical theories then, but they stand in need of something to make them real, you might say, or it's sometimes said that breathe fire into the equations. Well, what could that be? Right? Maybe this thing called presence. Now, what is presence? Well, open your eyes, open your ears. Something is present to you. That is presence. Mark Johnson writes, when we attend to the structure of any conscious act, there is an object of consciousness, be it an external item or an experience, thought, emotion, belief, and there's the manner of presentation of that object. Now, it is extremely natural, and I have been speaking in terms of presence to mind. Stop thinking like that. Try to think the invert. Presence is what's fundamental, not minds. Right? Subjects and objects are going to turn out to be nexuses or assemblages of elements of presence. Right? So we're going to try and explore this idea. Take presence as fundamental. And I think this is very close to William James's neutral monism. And presence would be translated in his terms into what he called pure experience. Actually, this explains to me why he called it experience at the same time as saying it wasn't experience. Right? Presence is fundamental. Experience is when you look at it as mental. Right? So normally, we think of subjects or brains as a source of presence. You shut your eyes, the room is not present. You open your eyes, now the room is present. I have created presence, or I'm a source of presence. Don't think like that. Think like this. Think of us as samplers of presence, not creators of presence. Here's James describing his pure experience, the world of pure experience. James says, my thesis is if we start with the supposition that there is one primal stuff or material in the world, a stuff of which everything is composed, and if we call that stuff pure experience or presence, then knowing can easily be explained as a sort of relation towards one another into which portions of pure experience may enter. The relation itself is part of pure experience. One of its terms becomes the subject, and the other becomes the object known. Mark Johnson writes, including the parentheses, that's in the quote, being is by its nature present. Being's fundamental activity is self-disclosure. Yes, I know where that leads, says Johnson. That's the idea, right? Now, this leads to a view maybe like panpsychism, but it's one that does not accept that subjects or minds are fundamental, nor is the physical fundamental. Rather, presence itself, which we can partially access in our own ways, that is what is fundamental. So the world is a world of present qualities. Now, how much is present? This is an interesting question, actually. What is present? Well, some things are present to me. Do I exhaust the limits of presence? If presence is fundamental and not relative to subjects, then why would I think there is any presence except what I have here? This I would call sparse presence. I don't think I can refute it. It's equivalent to solipsism. There's an interesting book by Caspar Hare that explores this idea with the great title, On Myself and Other Less Important Subjects. How could I be, if presence is fundamental and not relative to subjects, how could I be missing any? Right? Well, I think you can find ways to answer this question. I would try this way. Within the realm of presence, you can define systems or subsets that have certain characterizations. Features of perspective, yeah, my presence has perspective. Coherence, yes, I have coherent sets of presence. Phenomenological subjectivity, protension, retention, these are features we know to be present. And therefore, the overall system of presence will generate or encompass experiencing subjects to which not everything will seem to be present. The opponent to sparse presence is what I call abundant presence. And that's at the limit. It says being is presence. Everything that is present. Or, if you would like to see ultimate reality, open your eyes and open your ears. That is it. Right? Ultimate reality is right before our eyes. Now, if we take this view, try to take it seriously, what about agents in the world of presence? How should they regard the world? Right? Now, the world of objects and properties is evident, and it is the arena of action. It's not ontologically fundamental because once we introduce the agent, we have differentiated presence into subject and object, which is an operation which is permissible. It seems maybe in some way inevitable. But it means that the world of objects and subjects is derivative. Right? Maybe it's the world of Maya. Right? Now, once we have made the differentiation into subject and object, the world becomes explicable and predictable in its own terms, within itself. And this is the possibility of science, including the science of the neural correlates of consciousness. Nothing prevents this, right? But this does mean that science loses its role as the task of revealing the nature of reality. Many people are wedded to the idea that empirical science that is their job, right? To reveal the ultimate nature of reality. And this picture does mean that is not quite correct. Science is revealing the nature or the structure of the derivative world of subject and object. It instead has, well, the weighty, it's a hard job, it has the weighty role of intra-world explanation and prediction. This is what I think, pardon for the spelling mistake, this is what I think James meant by his radical empiricism, and maybe what in quantum mechanic interpretation cubism is about. Maybe. We have the world expert here. Now, is this a kind of panpsychism? Not all subsets of presence constitute subjects. So universal presence or abundant presence is not the same thing as universal minds. So it does not, this picture doesn't posit that the world is made out of a set of, a set where everything is a mind. That is denied. I'm not sure what the right ontological level for mind is, right? But presence is the what it is like of experience. Open your eyes and that is what it is like, and that is what is present. Systems of presence will form the subjects and objects in the world. So in a sense, the world is made of phenomenology. So I guess that's a kind of panpsychism. But the world is not made of micro-minds. Neither subject nor object are fundamental. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
So the next speaker is then Dr. Harald Atmos from Collegium Helvetium Zurich, and his topic is the Pauli-Jung conjecture and some of its implications, not all of them.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks much, Pablo. Thank you very much for coming to this talk. Actually, I plan to say more or less the same as Bill Seeger already said, but with a different set of slides. And with a different kind of background, maybe also. I want to talk about a kind of approach toward the mind-body problem, which has been proposed originally by Wolfgang Pauli, a physicist, and by Carl Jung, a psychologist, in collaborative work. And I also want to, in the second part of the talk, I want to go into some of the implications for science, actually. So what's a conjecture? A conjecture in mathematics is a hypothesis that is plausible but unproven. And in mathematics, the whole idea behind this is that at some time, it may become possible to really prove it rigorously. And then it moves from being a conjecture to a theorem. Now in philosophy, I don't know whether this is so easy. Maybe in philosophy, a hypothesis can never really be proven rigorously, but we may be able to collect evidence for it. And it may be that we can collect evidence to an extent that it makes it possible to maybe rule out alternative hypotheses. Now, the Pauli-Jung conjecture is a proposed dual aspect approach to the mind-body problem, mind-matter problem, alternative to interactive dualism. That's more or less the role model of Cartesian dualism. Idealism, you all know the German idealists, or Berkeley or others, and also physicalism, which is, of course, the mainstream movement in many sciences, and also in the philosophy of mind, I should say today. So all these three alternatives, interactive dualism, idealism, and physicalism, to Pauli and Jung appeared as literally, that's what they said, too cheap. So they were looking for something which is more comprehensive and maybe more convincing or compelling to them. Now there are two generally different modes of dual aspect thinking. One of them is the compositional mode, I call it, and the other one is the decompositional mode. The compositional mode is like this. You're assuming something like psychophysically neutral elements. So these elements are neither mental nor material nor physical. And depending on how you configure these elements, you end up having either mental or physical properties. And of course, in this compositional mode, the idea is that you ultimately might be able to reduce the mental and the physical to these psychophysically neutral elements. And the whole idea is inspired by classical system theory, where you have parts that you put together and then you get something like wholes. Mark, James, and also neutral monism in the spirit of Bertrand Russell are of this kind, and what Dave Chalmers proposes in chapter 8 of The Conscious Mind is also inspired the same way. It's an information-based compositional dual aspect model. The decompositional mode is just putting this picture upside down. Here you have a psychophysically neutral whole, not elements, you have a whole. You don't have a Lego world, you have a whole. And this whole you can partition. You can make distinctions or differentiations. And these differentiations at some point will include the one between the mental and the physical. Maybe this is one of the most fundamental ones. And so in this picture you cannot reduce, because, at least not in the usual sense of the word, because it would seem strange to reduce the properties of parts to a whole. So this picture is not reductive, and it's not inspired by classical system thinking. It's inspired by quantum holism. The world does not offer itself to us in terms of Lego building blocks. It offers itself as a whole, and in some sense, we have to decompose it. And the Pauli-Jung scheme belongs to this class of decompositional dual aspect thinking. Another very popular model is due to David Bohm, has been elaborated further by Basil Hiley, and Paavo, the chairman of this session, also has spent work in this direction. Now, this is a pictorial representation of, it's very nice because it also has a lot of symbolic background here, Pauli-Jung dialogue by a Munich artist. And here is how it all began. A letter from Pauli to Erna Rosenbaum of February 1932. And Pauli writes, I don't know who you are, old or young, physician or amateur psychoanalyst, completely unknown or very famous, or something in between. I only know that Mr. Jung quickly gave me your address and mentioned that I should write to you. The background is that I consulted Mr. Jung a week ago because of some neurotic symptoms, which, among other things, have to do with the fact that it is easier for me to achieve success in academia than with women. I mean, by that time, Pauli had already discovered the exclusion principle. He had predicted the neutrino. I mean, these are all milestones in theoretical physics. But his first marriage was divorced after half a year, and several other things had happened with him and his relationship to the other gender. And Pauli ends this brief letter to Erna Rosenbaum with this sentence: since for Mr. Jung, the opposite is the case, he seemed the right person to me to ask for medical advice. So this is how it all started off. And so you see, this is 1932. Pauli died in 58 and Jung in 61. From this point on, there was a very close and almost like friendship-like relationship between the two. It was very collegial, and almost all of it is fixed in the correspondence between them. Today, we wouldn't be able to retrieve this in our age because everything is on email, and most of the emails you, I hope, delete after 2 weeks. So in our times, it would be very hard to retrieve all this interesting material, which we, in this case, have for the time between 1932 and 58. Now, all this material remained undisclosed, actually, until the early 1990s, and only then it became possible to really look into the letters. And Hans Primas, with whom I was working at that time in Zurich, and myself, we found this material so interesting that we tried and reconstructed from all this correspondence a kind of systematic philosophical model of all that thinking that Jung and Pauli had exchanged. And that ended up to be the Pauli-Jung conjecture. Now, in the Pauli-Jung conjecture, you have a mental side, a mental domain, let me say, and a material domain. And if the picture wouldn't be more than that, this would be very close to a kind of substance dualism, like Cartesian-type dualism. But in the dual aspect approach, you have something below the horizontal line. And that's the domain in which the mental and the material, the mental and the physical, are not yet divided. That's why people speak about the psychophysically neutral domain for this. And for Jung, the access to this domain was through his notion, through his idea of the collective unconscious, a layer of the unconscious which is not specific to the individual, but which is collective in the sense that everybody who has some kind of consciousness this consciousness is based on a kind of collective level, which is there for everybody. It's not individual. And for Pauli, on the other hand, the access to this psychophysically neutral domain was through quantum mechanics, through the holistic feature that he realized very early is essential for understanding quantum reality. So the local reality that we observe in our experiments and observations is sitting here. The holistic part, the non-local part, is sitting below the horizontal line. The local part in the mental domain, conscious objects, representations, feelings, thoughts, whatever, is sitting here, and its unconscious basis is sitting below the horizontal line. Ultimately, when you are looking at this domain below the horizontal line, then you have this notion of the unus mundus that is intended in the limit as a completely undivided universe. No distinction whatsoever, and you may remember that that the title of one of the books that David Bohm actually published is exactly that, the undivided universe. So Bohm has exactly, in that point, he has exactly the same idea. In the limit, the universe is undivided. Of course, then you go on and introduce distinctions, differentiations, symmetry breakings, whatever you want to do. Some key features of this dual aspect model are the following. The undivided reality, the unus mundus, is one basic psychophysically neutral, now I should say ontological domain, because this is really what exists for them. Pauli and Jung really speculated, this is what exists. And this neutral domain has no distinctions such as mind and matter, subject and object, or self and world, and you name it. The mental and the physical emerge as epistemic domains, dual aspects in this sense, due to symmetry breakings of the holistic unus mundus. So we have a kind of ontic monism integrated together with an epistemic dualism in one picture. And at the epistemic level, we have psychophysical correlations which reflect the lost holism of the unus mundus. Once you break the symmetry, then the unus mundus is, in a certain sense, destroyed, if you want, but what remains are the different aspects, the mental and the physical, and the indicator of the lost holism are relations or correlations between the physical and the mental. Now, these psychophysical correlations are typically expressed, and now this is, of course, the field of Carl Jung, who had numerous patients and was studying these relations, expressed symbolically as meaningful correspondences. And these meaningful correspondences are, that was Jung's conviction, they are neither causal, they are not, I mean, usually when you look at correlations, you try to find a causal reason for them. So this you would not be able to do here. But also, on the other hand, they are not randoms. There's something in between, something different from this, and I will come to this. So in dual aspect approaches of the decompositional kind, psychophysical correlations are relations between the self model of a subject and the world model of a subject or a set of subjects in an intersubjective sense. Now, why was Pauli so much interested in this? I mean, it's clear to see why Jung was interested in it, because Jung was working with symbolic images and dream interpretations and stuff like that all the time. But why was Pauli interested in this? Pauli was interested in this picture because he saw what he thought would be a very deep analogy, right? It's not an isomorphism. It's an analogy between a key feature of quantum physics and mind-matter relations. And I tried to sketch this out in this slide here. You have, in quantum physics, you have an entangled state written this way, and this inequality means that the entangled state is not a product state. It's not a product of state psi 1 and state psi 2. the two states that emerge if you, for instance, interact with the entangled states, with the entangled state. For instance, you can make a measurement or something like that. When you make the measurement, then you get two states, psi1 and psi2, which are correlated acausally, again. So there's no signal between psi1 and psi2 that creates the correlation. The origin of the correlation is just this entangled state. And this is broken up into two parts. And two parts are correlated, and the correlations are very rigid, they're very robust, so you can measure them with statistical analyses and so on. That has been done for more than 20 years, almost 30 years by now. So there are very robust results that really show us that this picture is completely correct for quantum mechanics, and Pauli already knew that, of course. Now, what's the analogy? The analogy is like this. For matter relations, we also have something like a state which is holistic. Here it is the psychophysically neutral state. Holistic in the sense that the mental and the physical are not yet decomposed. So they are just coupled together somehow. And as here, we can decompose the psychophysically neutral into a mental and a physical component. And then we get, like here, we get acausal correlations. There is no causal signal moving from here to here or from here to here, which generates the correlations. But now the correlations are not robust. They can be very evasive. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not there. They may not even be reproducible in a scientific sense. And the way in which these correlations can be seen, or experienced, I should say, is in terms of the meaning that connects the mental state and the mental state of the experiencing subject and the physical state, which is included in the experience. Jung called these experiences synchronicities or synchronistic correspondences. I'm sure many of you know about this. So this structural analogy, that was what really drove Pauli to invest thinking in this kind of picture. Now let me talk a little bit more about these psychophysical correlations, because this is what I consider as the first set of implications from this metaphysical framework. So from the Pauli-Jung conjecture, we obtain two types of psychophysical correlations. One type of them is what we call structural psychophysical correlations. They are persistent, they are stable. And the other type is induced or occasional psychophysical correlations. The structural correlations, the persistent ones, are robustly reproducible. Like in psychosomatics, we all know if we are put under stress, then our heart rate goes up. This is robustly reproducible. Or when we look at neural correlates of consciousness, then there are such correlates which are found in every individual. You give them a certain cognitive task, you will find a certain brain activity that always is correlated with the task. So these are the structural correlations. And then there are the other ones, the induced correlations, which are evasive, as I said before, and they are in general not strictly reproducible or even completely irreproducible. Structural psychophysical correlations, since they are so robust, can be considered as giving us a baseline for mind-body correlations. And the induced psychophysical correlations deviate more or less from this baseline. Now, deviations can be above or below the baseline, so they can be positive or negative. And we call the positive deviations experiences of coincidence. This would be something like meaningful correspondences, something like that. And deviations below the baseline would be deficit correlations, experiences of dissociation, like out-of-body experiences, things like that. But both types of deviations are experienced as meaningful, and they are experienced explicitly as meaningful just because they are deviations from the baseline. nobody experiences an increasing heart rate due to stress as particularly meaningful. But an out-of-body experience or something even more existential has a completely different status. And so Jung would like to talk about numinous experiences for extreme deviations and the ordinary case of correlations when there is no deviation at all. Now look at this picture. It's also a schematic diagram which shows you right here and right there these two types of excess and deficit correlations. Here they are called coincidence phenomena, and coincidence phenomena represent connections of ordinarily disconnected elements of self-model and world model. So whenever something happens that lets you see that there is, that you, for instance, you are in a mental state, in a mental representation that relates to something in the outside world, then, and this relation is not of the usual kind, of the ordinary kind, then this would be a coincidence experience. And here it's just the opposite case. The dissociation experience would be a disconnection of ordinarily connected elements of self-model and world model. Like, for instance, if you imagine the relation of mindness, which you have between, that's okay, between your mental image of yourself and your body, then this disconnection of this relation of mindness would exactly be what happens in out-of-body experiences, where your mental state is, where your mental system is in a state that seems to see the body as not belonging to the mental state. So I want to show you only very briefly that we have collected a lot of empirical material to check this kind of fourfold classification. By now we have more than 2,300 reports of these exceptional experiences collected at the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology at Freiburg. And you can, of course, if you prepare that material in an analyzable way, you can do all kinds of, can apply all kinds of statistical torture instruments. And I should emphasize that these analyses, these investigations, are focused really on the phenomenology of the experience. We're not asking about something like veridicality, does it really happen or something like that. We're not talking about existence issues because we are talking about epistemic aspects. We're not talking about the base reality in the sense of an ontological reality. Now, the analyses that have been carried out over several years support the four-pattern classification suggested by the model very nicely. Distributions over patterns are comparable for different subsamples, general population, clients in clinics, people with near-death experiences, people who are experienced meditators. They all give us the same distribution over the four different classes of patterns. And there are even psychophysical studies which have been conducted at the University Clinic at Zurich, which provide more information. For instance, we found ways to identify individuals with a disposition for coincidence experiences versus all the other types with certain kinds of experiments. So for more details on all this, I want to refer you to a talk by Wolfgang Fach, which is tomorrow afternoon in session B3. So everybody who is interested in more details on this, go to B3 tomorrow. Here is a sketch of a very compact summary of all these cases that we have investigated so far. What you see here is, again, coincidence, dissociation, external, internal, and the circles are encoded frequencies of occurrences of these exceptional experiences. So this is 0, it goes up to 1 is rarely, 2 is often, 3 would be very often, something like that. And these are, of course, mean values. And you see the highest proportions here are, what is it? are near-death experience people, and the dotted line experienced meditators. And the lowest values in the center of the graph here are, that is Swiss general population, a sample of 1,500 subjects, and what is the other one? This is also kind of general population, but just students. So, as I said, more about this tomorrow from Wolfgang. And so this was implication number 1. Implication number 2 is this. And I go through that in the remaining maybe 3 to 4 minutes. Pablo, is that okay? Yeah, okay, good. This is something that was addressed partly in the talk by Thomas Filk yesterday already. Let me just introduce this in a different way. This is about the way in which observational processes are treated in physics. In physics, observations are interactions of an observing system with an observed system, which is in a certain state, and with this state there are certain observables associated. And then the interaction can be either weak or strong. It's weak if there is no significant effect of the observing system on the observed system. If this effect makes a difference, then we speak of a strong interaction. Now in physics, the case of weak interactions is called the classical case. The classical case is commutative, the sequence in which you measure the properties or apply the operations does not make a difference. You can see this here. Whether you measure B first and then A, or A and then B, it's the same result. That's the commutative case. That's, of course, the law of commutativity, as you all know. In the quantum case, this law breaks down because the interaction is strong, and whatever measurement you do in the first instance, like B here, leads you into another state psi. And the second measurement A is done now no longer on psi, but the changed state B on psi. And of course, if you invert the sequence of measurements, you do A first and B second, it's quite illustrative that this result would not be the same. This is called the non-commutative case. So Wolfgang Pauli phrased this like this in a letter to Bohr in 1955. The observer in quantum mechanics brings forth a considerable trouble in nature without being able to influence its unpredictable outcome and results, which afterwards can be objectively checked by everyone. Last slide. Observing mental states now. This is, of course, now the other epistemic domain, not the physical, but the mental. In psychology, I think it's very plausible to assume that almost every action of an observing system entails a significant effect on S. Whenever I ask you a question or put a questionnaire to you, and you start answering that question, then this changes your state of mind. I think this is very evident. So strong interactions between observer and observed is the rule rather than the exception. Observing a mental state is not only reading off a value, accepting an answer, it also means to change the subject's state. That's very typical for the non-commutative case, so there's a very strong similarity here, which Thomas Filk has addressed yesterday too. And as a result, successive observations are sequence dependent. And this means measurements are non-commutative operations, not only in physics, now also in psychology. Of course, psychology didn't develop its theoretical tools into this direction so far, but you see that, and this has been mentioned before, that there are a number of approaches now which some people call quantum cognition, or others would say non-commutative structures in cognitive systems. And here is a number of examples, like bistable perception. I talked about that on Tuesday. Decision processes, order effects in questionnaires and surveys, learning in networks, concept combinations, and there are many more applications by now, and there are cognitive science groups all over the globe who are now taking up this program in which psychological models are based on non-commutative structures, Hilbert space models, whatever you want to see. And this is in a way, the second implication of the model, because when you have a psychophysically neutral reality and one of its manifestations in physics gives you non-commutativity as a rule, then it is very straightforward to look for these non-commutative structures also in the other manifestation, in the psychological domain. And this is exactly what we see in these recent developments in quantum cognition. A brief summary, the Pauli-Jung conjecture of dual aspect monism with mind and matter as complementary dual aspects. Two types of mind-matter correlations, one of them the reproducible baseline correlations, the other evasive and non-reproducible deviations from these robust correlations. The robust correlations form an ordinary structural baseline, and we can see the induced correlations as deviations above and below the baseline. The Pauli-Jung conjecture gives rise to systematic and empirically supported typology of exceptional experiences. That was the work that I presented to you in terms of these pretty huge samples of subjects that we investigated. And implication number 2, the Pauli-Jung conjecture predicts non-commutative processes in psychology as a natural consequence. Thank you very much.
Right, okay. Thank you all the speakers, and I think we now ask the speakers to come over here, and we have plenty of time for discussion. Maybe we'll let them sit down first. Okay, so we have, do we have 2 queues, or we'll take first one from here, please.
I'd like to ask Martina the question, or no, ask Descartes. So I agree with you that we have a nature-revealing conception of an aspect of our nature. I agree that we understand what it is to have an experiential property and what it is for that experiential property to be had by me. But I don't know how I can be so sure that that is my complete nature, that there aren't also other aspects to my nature that are outside of that awareness. And it seems to me, without being able to conclude that, I don't see how you can infer your strong metaphysical conclusion of the simplicity of subjects.
Well, I didn't want to argue that given self-awareness, we have access to the complete nature of ourselves. What I thought I can argue for is simply that we have access to what it is for us to be identical across time and at the same time and so on. Right? This doesn't yet imply that this is all that we can say about our own metaphysical nature. And in fact, I think there's more to be said about it. For instance, what you were talking about seems to me that it's also part of the nature of subjects, that they are capable of being active in a certain sense.
But perhaps these other aspects of my nature that are not revealed to me are relevant to my identity over time. So perhaps when God looks at me, as it were, and sees not only my experiential nature, but these other aspects, my identity over time looks very different. And so maybe you're getting a wrong conception of your identity over time because you're just focusing on one aspect of your nature.
Sorry, can you say this? There's something I missed. Can
Maybe,
you say this?
so you're agreeing there might be other aspects to our nature other than what's experiential, and they might be relevant to our identity over time. So maybe you're getting a wrong conception of your identity over time because you're ignoring these other aspects that might be relevant.
Yeah, I think I have to disagree there. and I think the reason why I disagree is that your identity is determined. Oh, no, I shouldn't say it in this way. That you are the subject undergoing a certain experience, just is that it's something like for you to undergo it, right? And that exhausts what it is to be the case that it's you who undergoes that experience. And on that I would insist, right? And that suffices for my argument to go through. There can be many other aspects that they won't change anything about this very simple fact. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Let's take the next question from the other line.
Okay. My question is directed to Harald Atmanspacher. And I think the idea of decomposition is quite convincing, but I would like to ask about the analogy of decomposition in the field of mind and body, because in quantum physics, decomposition occurs due to observation or measurement. But if we go to the topic of body and mind, what would there be decomposition, since we cannot presuppose subject and object beforehand, but for observation or measurement, subject and object are required to exist beforehand?
Yes, that's a good question, and my answer is I don't know. I mean, I could tell you a long story why I don't know, but I essentially don't know, and this is also why Pauli did not say that this is more or less the same. He said that there is an analogy that he sees, and in a sense, he would probably suggest that this is actually a research program. In physics, we have certain concepts, also mathematical concepts, with which we treat decompositions, like symmetry breakdown or projections or whatever. But we don't know right now what exactly applies to this case, to the mind-matter case. This is, if you want, ongoing research.
Okay.
And also, let me make one additional statement. I think the main reason why we don't know how to do this is that we know not much about this psychophysically neutral reality. In physics, when we talk about entangled states and how they are decomposed, then we know a lot from the theory about the nature of entangled states. So we can really apply all the formalism that we have. We don't have something like that for the psychophysically neutral domain yet.
And would it be possible in your conception that decomposition is performed in the brain?
I don't think it is. I don't think one should look at it in this individualized sense. It should be something more general. I mean, if you want, in the universe. So I didn't allude to panpsychism in my talk, because that would have opened up another box of Pandora, if you want. But I think there are some ideas in panpsychism that are very close to what we are talking here in the Pauli-Jung conjecture. And then, of course, in panpsychism, you don't need a brain to talk about the mental and the physical.
Okay. I use my, how would you say, authority as a chair, and I would ask Roger Penrose, because he wanted to ask a question, and he had, Roger, would you please want to come and ask your question?
I had no intention to queue jump. I'm sorry about this. No, I just wanted to raise an issue which I think needs to be raised. I mean, there's a lot of confusion, which is the ideas of quantum mechanics creates, because in quantum mechanics, if you take it seriously, as certainly was believed at the time of Pauli, you have to consider that all these states of the world are entangled, and you don't have really a clear view of reality, because states are just, they don't look like the world, because as time progresses, they get more and more entangled, and so there's no particular picture of the world, and people get worried about this. However, if you have a theory beyond quantum mechanics in which the quantum state is the reduction of the quantum state, or the collapse of the wave function, is a real process, and people never really took that seriously, I think, certainly in early quantum mechanics, then you have a picture of the world which is much more like a classical world, because the collapse of the wave function cuts the entanglements with other states. And so you don't have this kind of wishy-washy view of the world as being somehow all a big entangled mess, which you can't kind of separate out into a picture of the world which was previously presented by classical physics. So if you do have the collapse of the wave function being a physical process which actually takes place out there and is not a question of different people's consciousness or that sort of thing, then you have a picture much more like classical physics, which certainly seems to agree with our experiences on the large scale. And people, without having an objective view of the collapse of the wave function, which certainly people didn't have at the time that Pauli was thinking about the picture of the world, then one is led to these global entanglements and not a sort of global picture of the world. So I wonder what the view was about that.
Yeah, I think maybe that, does this go to me? I guess yes.
Yeah.
Right? Or do you want to answer that? No. I entirely share the opinion that measurement is a physical process that takes time, right? That's objective reduction.
Yeah.
And in the picture this is, of course, this is a cartoon, right? But in the cartoon, I would say measurement is the process that leads from the wishy-washy thing into the upper right corner of this cartoon, which is local realism, classical realism. Exactly, that's what it is. So whenever you do a measurement, it's completely local, no doubt about that. So what Pauli and Jung speculated, I mean, in this case, of course, Pauli more than Jung, was that still there is some kind of ontological reality to the wishy-washy thing.
Okay, yes.
You call it the wishy-washy. I don't call it that way.
No,
I call it
an appropriate term. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So let's go for it. And so, but do you understand what I wanted to say? So, measurement in the time of Pauli was by many people considered as just a mathematical operation called projection. Mm. I don't agree with that. I agree much more with what you say. There is an objective process out there, yeah. But still we can see that in this sketch. We can see it as the transformation from the wishy-washy to the locally realistic world of classical physics.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's take the next one also from this slide. Sorry. Excuse for that, yes.
Yeah, I'm almost sorry, but it's another question to Harald Atmansbacher. Yeah, so thank you for this interesting theory. I always find it very enriching to think in a new way about things. And I do appreciate a lot that you actually collected empirical data to support your theory. Now my question is, do you think that there might be more parsimonious approaches in standard psychological theories to explain this data? And if yes, do you see other ways of other questions that could be answered by data that would support your point even more and that make it stronger against this criticism?
So let me first address the point of parsimony. I refer to several examples which are now often discussed under the notion of quantum cognition, right? And what we see is that, for instance, models in psychology of how questionnaires are answered, decision processes in a general sense, how these models in psychology really change from instantiation to instantiation. Almost every experiment needs another model. Now, there's a paper in PNAS 2 or 3 years ago by a group of Indiana University, Jerry Busemeyer and others, who investigated 70-something different cases of questionnaire studies and survey studies, which all have different models in standard psychology, with one and the same Hilbert space model, right? And they can see that in all these different surveys, the same model explains the result. This is an extremely powerful general outcome because this is actually parsimonious. So we are already there, in a way. Now, I just went through these two different broad classes of implications of the whole approach, and I have some ideas in the background which we can talk about in private, but they are not really mature enough to really be put out in the public. But I think in these two lines of research that I already pointed out, there is still a lot of material open where you can develop ideas and where you can refine the results. And we are in a way we are. When you look at the development of biology, then botany in the 18th century started with pure classifications of phenomena. And this is where we are in terms of mind-matter relations. Classifications, and then we can see whether this phenomenon fits there or whether it fits better there, something like that. So we're in the first stages still. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's have now from the other line, please.
Yes, I have a question both to Harald and to Bill Seeger. Because in both your presentations, there's this basic dualism of, let's say, duality of mind and matter derived presumably from something more basic, right? Whether it's the unus mundus or presence. But the thing is, one way to think of it is that fundamental element is neutral, really ontologically neutral, right? But another option is to think of it as, it may not be standard sort of mental in the sense of ordinary subjectivity with a subject-object structure and all these differentiations of contents and so on, but it could be just some kind of like a, pure consciousness. And at least in James, which Bill mentioned, part of the problem has always been that pure experience that just doesn't seem to be neutral, right? It seems to be much more on the mental kind of pole. Now, obviously, it's different than ordinary, if you identify this mental with subjectivity in the ordinary sense, then it's become analytic. But my question, this other alternative of thinking of that fundamental element as not entirely neutral, but something like consciousness, only of a different kind, whereas like pure consciousness, we find it for example, in Indian philosophy and in some mystical traditions and so on. So I guess my question is, do you think it's just a matter of words? Do you think that this kind of thinking of that question, whether this fundamental element is ontologically neutral, or whether it's just a different kind of mentality, let's say, or to think of it in terms of consciousness? Do you think it's just a matter of words, or do you think it's a fundamental issue and worth thinking about, and so on? What's your position on it?
Well, James himself was conflicted about this, and towards the end of his life, in an interesting notebook, he opts for panpsychism. Says, yeah, actually, it's more mental. But I think we can retain the notion of the neutral. If I ask you right now, what is present to you? Most of what is present to me is not mental. It's physical. Right? People, chairs, tables. Yeah? And I have to work a bit to find something mental that's present to me. There are other times when that's not the case. So it seems to me we shouldn't think of the basis of reality as itself either mental or physical. What is present to us is both, right? The ontological basis for it can take either role. As James says, it will depend upon the set of relations that it enters into. I could discover that I'm dreaming. So, what's present was mental. I don't think I am dreaming, so what's present is physical. But what lurks behind that derivative state is something which is neither. So I think there's still room for an idea of the neutral. Although I recognize it leans towards the mentalistic, right? Since in some way it's phenomenological.
Yeah, maybe very brief. Is this only a play with words, you asked? Yes or no? I would say yes and no in some sense, because of course if you make your if you make your position really clear what you mean, then in principle you can call it pure experience, you can call it presence, you can call it unus mundus, you can call it even like Gale and Strawson, you can call it real physicalism, something like that. That would be alluding to exactly the other side. But if you talk to an audience to which you want to make as clear as possible what you think, then you should not leave too much room for free-floating interpretations, right? That's why I love the notion of the neutral, the psychophysically neutral, because that doesn't have any leaning to this or that side. And also, when I say that the mental and the physical are just generated by a kind of distinction which is not there primordially, then I should find something, some notion for this primordially undivided domain, which is not contaminated, let me say, with notions that actually then belong to the result of the discrimination. So that's what that's yes and no.
Okay, thank you. Let's have the next question here, please.
Yeah, yes, thank you. I was really blown away by this last Pauli Jung conjecture thing, and I wanted to share a perspective. As an artist and a human being, often you have this idea floating somewhere that you're trying to express, and it have led me to sort of contemplate the perspective that there's this cosmic consciousness that's trying to express something, and that this may be the driving dynamic behind these things. In 2011, I wrote an article which can be found on Gaia.dk, where I was exploring the principle of reciprocity. How would it be if there was this cosmic consciousness which tried to express something in objectivity? What would be required to do that? And I arrived at 6 steps that would be needed to do that. And actually, I will suggest that it might be possible to derive quantum mechanics and relativity from first principles by considering it in this way. So that was a little sharing, and I would love some feedback on that article. But my question would be, how do you think about the principle of reciprocity, the universe trying to create an evolution where we can exchange at atomic level, cellular level, human level, and maybe even greater levels as the driving principle behind what we are observing?
Yeah, I don't know your work, obviously, but the notion of reciprocity, the bell that this rings to me in the Pauli Jung conjecture is actually that there is some kind of bidirectional traffic between the psychophysically neutral that you call cosmic consciousness or something. That would be the psychophysically neutral in my picture. Between that and the mental, both the mental and the physical domain, there is traffic upward and downward. And so the psychophysically neutral, or your cosmic consciousness, tries to express itself in the physical and the mental domain, and yet there is feedback from there into that kind of neutral. And so that's the bell that reciprocity rings for me. Maybe that's related to what you're thinking, I don't know.
Let's have the next question there, please.
Yes, thank you for the 3 of your presentations. Very provocative. I'm going to try to avoid the haziness of dealing with this primordial subject and to what extent language actually infects or makes it difficult to answer certain questions. But I'll try to be specific examples. With the first speaker, what about how does time enter into this pre-reflective ontological category? For example, awareness of being the subject. Is that awareness several awarenesses, or is it just timeless in some literal way? With the second speaker, solipsism. I mean, yes, there's a presence here that is relating to me, but you mentioned about the presence that we cognitively know that there are other people having presences, but doesn't that leave the realm of presence and enter into a reflective category to know that there are other presences involved? And the final example is, which I mentioned before to Professor Atmos, out of body. Now, for the first person perspective, is it an example of a deep underlying reality that is coming to this person, or is it simply illusory? And are we saying illusory from the cognitive, linguistic, third-person perspective, or illusory from the first person? Maybe the questions can't be answered, but I'll throw them out.
So I was thinking of experiences as being temporally extended, and I was thinking of that pre-reflective self-awareness that we have of being the subject undergoing the experience as well as being temporally extended. And this raises interesting issues that are left out for reasons of time. Namely, I really would like to say, and this is important for the purposes I was talking about, that we are aware of being the one single subject which has a certain experience now and another experience then, and so on. And okay, so this was implicit and
Multiple experiences.
I'm sorry?
In other words, multiple experiences of this underlying category of pre-reflective ontological
multiple
mind.
Experiences. I don't know how to count experiences. I don't think there's a non-arbitrary way to count experiences. But I think there is a non-arbitrary way to count experiencing subjects. So I take their identity very seriously. I do not take the question about identity of experiences seriously at all.
Okay. So let's have over here, please.
Well,
Sorry, do you want?
all three of us, apparently. The idea of solipsism as a philosophical doctrine is difficult to decisively refute. As Russell said, I'm surprised more people don't embrace it. But it is a question of theorizing about the nature of presence and its extension. So yeah, it comes after the experience of presence that you start to think about how extensive is it, are there other subjects, and the view that there are other subjects is just way more conducive to ordinary thought and success in life.
The question was about out-of-body experiences. Are they illusory or not? I think they are phenomenally real, but they are epistemic. They are taking place in your or mine or everybody else's reality model. And the whole point of the dual aspect framework is to make a distinction between the epistemic aspects in which these phenomena are experienced and the ontological, let me say, base reality, if you want.
So
in that base reality, there are no phenomena that we experience.
Okay, so shall we move on? Let's have the next question, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question for William Seeger, but also to Harald. What about the risk of epiphenomenalism, with, broadly speaking, with panpsychist approaches? Because it seems to me that positing this neutral aspect, underlying aspect of reality, in principle, doesn't make any difference for the physical aspect of things. And so, for example, could it be possible to devise an empirical test to check whether there is this neutral layer of reality or whether there is just a physical layer? Because it seems to me that if it was possible, then it would mean that, after all, it takes place in the physical aspect of reality. And if it wasn't possible, then it would relegate panpsychism in general to some kind of epiphenomenal aspect of the mental, no matter whether it is ontologically underlying rather than being like in Davidson, just on a parallel layer. So I'm just trying to wonder about these two aspects. And finally, about William, you said that the world is phenomenology, and you said it doesn't matter whether we use the word presence or other word. But it seems to me that the word presence is reflective of presence to someone. So it is a kind of leftover of the phenological tradition. So I would skip altogether with that word and use something more neutral, like just existence, or something even better, but that doesn't remind of any previous tradition. Thank you.
Thank you. If being equals presence, then existence would be a word that you could use. That's right. I want to start from something which we can recognize as available. Right? It's not theoretically, it's not evident that existence is what is available to minds. Right? Now, you're right, presence is normally thought of as what is present to a mind, so it seems to involve a subject. But I think it is possible to invert the normal way of thinking and take presence as the fundamental, and then, as it were, construct subjects and objects from systems of presence. Causal relations, well, this is very tricky. Within the ordinary world, which is post the development of the split between subject and object, that's where the normal home of causation is. And there are lots of causal relations between the mental and the physical and vice versa. Within this pure realm of presence, it has its own dynamical development, which is in some way reflected in our appreciation of causal relations within the world of subjects and object, but is also more fundamental than it. So if you take causation to be what we learn about in our ordinary interactions in the world, mental and physical are interacting all the time.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Ricardo, is it Ricardo?
Yes.
Yes. Can you ask me the question that went to me again?
Well, basically about epiphenomenalism. How can you be sure that it doesn't lead to epiphenomenalism?
That doesn't lead to epiphenomenalism. I mean, epiphenomenalism is something that usually is discussed together with a kind of variety of different types of physicalisms, and one of them would be the epiphenomenal variety. So what you try to say is that you have a physical basis, and then in epiphenomenalism you say that there may be something that appears to us mental, but it has no causal powers in some sense, right? So there's a kind of asymmetry between the physical and the mental. In the Pauli Jung conjecture, this asymmetry does not exist. I think you can. I mentioned this bidirectional traffic between the neutral and the physical and the mental. You can have influences from the mental to the neutral and from the physical to the neutral. Of course, these influences will look differently, but from both domains you can have kind of, I don't dare to call them causal in the usual sense, because I don't know the role of time in these things, but there should be some kind of influence that is possible. Now, the other part of your question was about testing the metaphysics. I mean, this is, of course, notoriously difficult, because almost by definition, you cannot a test, as you mentioned it, is of course a kind of procedure that is intended to provide knowledge for you. And once you have the knowledge, this is epistemic. And so you're in that moment you're out of the ontic domain already. Now there's a very interesting idea that has been pushed forward by Abner Shimoni in several articles, and he also wrote a book with the title, what is the title? Experimental Metaphysics.
Yes.
So I would say there is no direct access, at least scientific access, in the sense of third-person perspective and so on, to the metaphysical ontic domain. But maybe there are indirect methodologies to do this, and Shimoni suggested how this works for, of course, exactly for the notion of entanglement. I mean, if you have a state that you don't observe, and then you observe it, then you get a result, and then, of course, at the same time you change the state, so the state is still, it's another state, but it's still unknown. So if you have a good theory that connects the ontic and the epistemic domain, and in some sense quantum mechanics does this, then you can make predictions about the ontic state, which can be violated if you measure it epistemically. And that's, I would say, the Bell inequalities give us such a picture. You assume something about the nature of the ontic, make measurements, which can be violated if that assumption is wrong.
Okay.
But I don't have any idea about something like that for this psychophysically neutral.
Okay, thank you very much. And then we'll take from there. And we have now about 9 minutes and I think 7 questions still on the line. So short questions, short answers, or else otherwise people won't be able to ask that question. Please.
My question is for Martina about the first syllogism. I was just wondering if it's valid, but I wonder about the soundness of it is dependent on this pre-reflective self-awareness of the X subject, where that phenomenal property or experiential property P needs to be in relation to X. You say that X is aware of itself pre-reflectively, but I feel like that needs already a P property in that special ontological category that you described later on in the syllogism. So I just wonder where this pre-reflection comes from.
I'm not sure I really understood the question. Are you asking whether that being pre-reflectively aware of oneself is itself an experiential property?
Yeah, I guess that's, yeah.
Yes, I want to say that.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I have a question for Harald Atmansbacher and maybe also William Seeger. You have a take on that. So if we start from a dual aspect theory, how would you suggest to go about that methodologically? Like, especially for an empirically working psychologist or neuroscientist, should we do in order to establish those acausal correlations? Because I guess there's a lot of work to do. And specifically, what do you think about the neurophenomenological research program, where the idea is to actually try to develop and use more rigorous first-person methods in order to get a more detailed and perhaps more reliable picture of the mental aspect?
Yeah, neurophenomenology is very welcome. That was the second question. And the first question is, you know, I tried to give you some ideas where we are going, and this is, of course, a specific focus, that this is about exceptional experiences. So you need subjects, the more the better, and it's sometimes difficult to get them. The results that I presented to you, these are empirical results. These are results from let's say, 25 years of collecting data and maybe 5 or 6 years of analyzing them. So there's a huge amount of work that has been done already. And of course, everybody is welcome to join in and do more, you know. These things, you know, science usually works in small steps. And if you make steps that are too big, then you might overlook something and come to wrong conclusions. So this is such a big issue that I would say we should not hope to resolve it within our lifetimes. Maybe the younger generation, yes, but Bill and myself certainly no.
Well, it's a great question. My views are not sufficiently worked out yet to be decisively refuted. But very roughly speaking, the picture would be there is the world in which we find ourselves. Science is primarily, or maybe solely, devoted to working out the patterns that we find in that world. So neurophenomenology is wonderful. It's great. Now, the picture holds that there's a kind of background reality, which is the pure presence. Science does not investigate that. Right? Now, does it make a difference to us? Well, I think it might, but it would be a kind of revelatory difference. It would be your attitude towards the world that you find yourself in would change. But science would proceed as normal and can perhaps find the exact correlates between brain and conscious states. There would be no problem with that, I don't think.
Thank you. Okay, so we have another 4 minutes, and let's have from there, please.
Yeah. So, very short question to Harald Atmans-Pacher. So, I would like to know if you see any link between synchronicities and temporal non-locality.
Yes.
Could you elaborate a little more?
Yeah, this is. I would say, the notion of synchronicity, as Jung brought it into the discussion when he actually brought it up, generates the wrong impression that the two events that are synchronistically coupled have to happen at exactly the same time. And in discussion with Pauli, they already, when Pauli tried to convince him that this is a misnomer, and that therefore Pauli was never talking about synchronicity, he was talking about meaningful correspondences, and these correspondences can extend over time. The mental and the physical does not need to happen at the same time. They just need to be coupled by some kind of, they called it common meaning, and that's why Pauli liked the notion of meaningful correspondence. So meaning would be the currency that connects the two, and the issue that you're raising, temporal non-locality, of course also addresses a kind of temporal duration which can exist between the beginning and the end of a kind of correspondence. And typically experiences are temporally extended, so they have this kind of temporal non-locality, and in that sense I could imagine one might think further. Is that about what you...
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
Thank
okay,
you.
good, thank you.
Then we have two more minutes, so please.
Yes.
Over here.
I wanted to ask, how is evolution relevant to your worldview? I mean, we know that the realm of interactions have been evolving. There were once creatures, there was once a planet with no life in it, and then the life appeared, and then creatures with brains appeared, and then creatures with more complicated brains appeared. How is it relevant? How is your views, how are your and Bill's view relevant to neuroscience?
Is it a question for all of us?
It is a question. For you specifically, I have another question, but there is no time, so I will ask you privately. but it is for Harald and for Bill.
For Bill.
1 minute answer is how important evolution. Okay. Evolution is a scientific achievement. The world as revealed by the theory of evolution is the best picture we have of the development of life on Earth. And I don't see any problem with my view fully accepting that.
Accepting, yes, but what difference, how do you contribute to it?
How am I contributing? Oh, I'm
Yes.
not an evolutionary biologist, so I'm not contributing at all to evolutionary theory.
I've lost my, now I have my voice back, great. So we thank the speakers and go for a break now. Thank you very much.